Imagine venturing deep into a tropical rainforest, armed with a weapon, wading through knee-deep mud amidst towering trees. You might stumble upon hundreds of enemies lurking in ambush with explosives and traps. Some of these enemies even wear gruesome trophies, the ears of fallen comrades dangling eerily around their necks. This was the reality of the Vietnam War, a conflict that struck terror into the hearts of those who experienced it. On November 14, 1965, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Division was dropped into a remote region of South Vietnam's Central Highlands near the Cambodian border. They were told there were North Vietnamese in the area, but they had no idea how many. What unfolded next would become one of the deadliest battles of the entire war, the Battle of La Drang. As the American soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, touched down in the La Drang Valley, caution was their watchword. Colonel Moore held the highest regard for his troops, and he knew the immense fighting prowess of the American soldier. With only 90 Americans on the ground initially, more reinforcements were on the way, but they remained severely outnumbered. Their situation took a dire turn when a North Vietnamese deserter was captured within the first hour. He revealed chilling news. 3 North Vietnamese regiments surrounded them, all intent on their destruction, but unable to locate them immediately. Around noon, chaos erupted in the jungle. As nightfall descended, the Americans hunkered down, listening to the North Vietnamese probing the area, attempting to pinpoint their location. War is already terrifying during the day, but in the darkness, it becomes a nightmarish horror movie. The intense fighting continued into the 3rd day, during which the Americans managed to secure a landing zone. By then, the North Vietnamese had suffered around 1,200 casualties, while the Americans had lost 79 of their own. Although they had an opportunity to evacuate their troops, some stayed behind against their better judgment. On the 4th day, the remaining battalions headed to a second landing zone, LZ Albany. Along the way, they fell into an enemy ambush, leading to a 16-hour battle of annihilation. This horrifying account showcases the brutal reality of warfare in the Vietnam War, a struggle that tested the limits of human endurance and courage. The Battle of La Drang was the U.S. military's first encounter with the North Vietnamese Regular Army, providing them with a bitter taste of what lay ahead. However, perhaps even more daunting were the fighters of the National Liberation Front, known as the Viet Cong. These individuals were like phantoms, well-versed in guerrilla warfare, intimately familiar with the jungle terrain, and experts at blending into local populations. These insurgents were locals sympathetic to the communist cause, determined to overthrow the US-backed government in the region. Ambushes were a common tactic employed by the Viet Cong, who would disguise themselves as civilians and strike when American soldiers were patrolling villages or conducting operations in populated areas. The Viet Cong excelled at deception and fraud. They went to great lengths to infiltrate American facilities and positions. For instance, a team of Viet Cong fighters, disguised as South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They dressed in stolen or replicated uniforms, carried fake ID cards, and concealed weapons beneath their clothing. They managed to breach the embassy's perimeter, engaging in a 6-hour firefight with American forces before being eliminated or captured. The audacity of infiltrating the U.S. Embassy was staggering. Similarly, during the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong targeted the U.S. military base at Khe Sanh, located near the demilitarized zone dividing North and South Vietnam. Employing a combination of conventional military tactics and disguises, they posed as local peasants or workers and placed explosive devices while conducting small-scale attacks around the base's perimeter. This strategy was intended to divert American forces and create distractions, enabling larger-scale assaults elsewhere. Although the Tet Offensive ultimately failed for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, it marked a crucial turning point in the war by revealing the limited progress made by the U.S. and South Vietnam against the North. It shattered the perception of an imminent American victory and led to a significant shift in public opinion. One of the reasons behind the Viet Cong's success in launching surprise attacks was their extensive network of tunnels. These tunnels, estimated to span tens of thousands of miles, served as a secret means of transportation, supply routes, and communication for the enemy forces. Discovering and navigating these dark and difficult tunnels was an extremely harrowing task during the war. Those entrusted with this mission were known as tunnel rats. Armed with minimal gear and equipped with just a flashlight, they ventured into the eerie, claustrophobic tunnels to search for enemy soldiers, weapons caches, and booby traps, and gather valuable intelligence. It was one of the most frightening and dangerous roles in the conflict. Tunnel rats, the soldiers tasked with this treacherous mission, faced the constant threat of being ambushed in these cramped, pitch-black tunnels. Close-quarter combat in such tight spaces left them with virtually no room to maneuver. As if the fear of enemy ambushes weren't enough, they also had to contend with a slew of deadly booby traps. These traps included explosives, pits lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, and deviously placed gift boxes filled with venomous snakes and spiders. Food was scarce, and the jungle's dangerous denizens, including venomous snakes, centipedes, scorpions, and spiders, added to the eerie atmosphere. Tunnel rats sometimes had to remain below ground for days on end, emerging only at night to scavenge for food. Malaria was a significant concern for Vietnamese soldiers trapped in these tunnels. In some instances, as reported, nearly half of an entire Viet Cong unit had contracted the illness. During the early stages of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, jammed M16 rifles became a prevalent and deadly problem for American soldiers. The situation was so dire that many soldiers resorted to picking up North Vietnamese AK-47, which were more reliable. The M16's predecessor, the AR-15, had shown promise with its lightweight design, accuracy, reduced recoil, and increased lethality. However, when the military made alterations to create the M16, such as adding a manual bolt closure and changing the barrel's spiral grooves, problems emerged. These unreliable M16 rifles put American soldiers at a severe disadvantage in the field. Imagine fighting with a weapon that often malfunctioned, leaving you vulnerable during firefights. Reports even circulated of soldiers attempting to clear their jammed guns with cleaning rods in the midst of battle. A survey conducted in 1967 found that a staggering 80% of the 1,586 soldiers surveyed reported their weapons jamming during combat. The term bui doi, meaning dust of life in Vietnamese, was used to describe children born to American fathers and Vietnamese mothers. Many U.S. soldiers had relationships with Vietnamese women, resulting in mixed-race children. These Amerasian children faced discrimination and hardship in both Vietnamese and American societies. In Vietnam, they were often stigmatized due to their foreign heritage, and in the United States, they struggled to find acceptance. After the war, attempts were made to evacuate some of these children from Vietnam through Operation Baby Lift. President Gerald Ford announced the plan to evacuate around 3,000 American orphans from Vietnam. However, tragedy struck during the first flight on April 4, 1975, when the cargo plane crashed, killing 138 people, many of them children. Despite this setback, Operation Baby Lift continued, eventually evacuating approximately 3,300 children from Vietnam. Over the years, the moral implications of these evacuation efforts have been debated, with questions arising about the motivations behind the operation and the care provided to these vulnerable children. Tiger cages were used during the Vietnam War as tiny cells to hold prisoners. These cages were designed to inflict pain and create conditions of extreme discomfort for those trapped inside. They were often small concrete trenches with bars on top, barely big enough to hold multiple human prisoners, let alone a tiger. The purpose of these tiger cages was to punish enemies, including Viet Cong fighters and suspected sympathizers, by subjecting them to deplorable conditions. Prisoners were crammed tightly into these cages, where they could barely move or stand. The conditions were unsanitary and inhumane, leading to various physical ailments such as tuberculosis, open sores, infections, and malnutrition. One of the most notorious sites where tiger cages were used was a South Vietnamese prison on Con Son Island. This prison held a mixture of accused Vietnamese communists, ethnic and religious minorities, and political dissidents. Conditions in the tiger cages at Con Son prison were even worse than in the regular prison, with around 500 people, both men and women, crammed into these cramped spaces. Despite efforts to keep the existence of tiger cages a secret, the truth came to light in 1970 when a congressional aide named Tom Harkin and a humanitarian volunteer and translator named Don Luch discovered them during a delegation visit. They took photographs of the tiger cages, but when the official report of the visit was published, there was no mention of these horrifying cells. Harkin eventually leaked the photos to Life magazine, leading to public outrage and further scrutiny of the war. The revelation of the tiger cages added to the growing opposition to the Vietnam War, as it exposed the brutal treatment of prisoners and the disregard for human rights in the conflict. That concludes this video. If you liked our content, consider subscribing to our channel. Thanks for watching. Until next time.